Namaste. Jai Shri
Namaste, everybody. Jai Shri Krishna. We're now continuing with chapter 2. We're going to start at verse 32. And if you remember, chapter 2 is the one where Bhagavan is explaining to Arjuna what are the different reasons he needs to fight as a soldier. So in verse 32 now, he continues with his theme, and he says,
Verse 32. Yadruchaya chopapannam swargadvaramapavrutam sukhinah kshatriyah partha labhante yuddhamidrisham. Now Bhagavan says, Yadruchaya chopapannam. Bhagavan says that this kind of war, Ruchaya chopapannam, he says by unsought, when any warrior gates, he says Swargadvaram apavrutam. Swargadvaram in this word it says celestial door. Apavrutam means which opens. He says when this kind of war, when any kshatriya means warriors, when they gate there, they become so happy, and when it comes on their way, it says that it opens the door of celestial abode, or we call it Swargadvaram. So Bhagavan says that you are so lucky to have this kind of war as a warrior.
so Sri Krishna says, O Parth, happy are the warriors to whom such opportunities to defend righteousness come unsought, opening wide for them the door to the celestial abodes. So I think the first thing to say is Sri Krishna therefore encouraging war and saying war is a great opportunity? No, he's not saying that at all. What he's saying is that as a soldier, it is the job of a soldier to defend territory, to defend people, to uphold freedoms, uphold rights. And when a war comes, which is unfortunate, but it's essential to fight it, then a soldier is very lucky if the war he gets to fight is a war for the sake of righteousness, rather than just, say, two countries fighting each other for a bit of land or a bit of territory. So we need to put his words into perspective first. So he's saying all of us come onto this planet, or any planet, for a purpose. We come to learn certain lessons or to teach certain lessons, to do certain things. So, for example, a really good doctor may have come to heal and to increase his knowledge of healing. A teacher comes to teach, and perhaps again to improve the way they teach, how they teach. But a soldier, what do they come for? They come to protect other people. They come to protect their freedoms. They come to protect their way of life and their right to lead their lives the way they wish. Now, when each of us completes our journey, as we will do, hopefully accomplishing what we came to do, which means doing our duties, willingly carrying out our responsibilities, then we will go to another dimension to rest before we continue our journey. So the assumption here is that you have not reached moksha, you have not achieved liberation yet. You're simply improving each time. Now, Bhagavan also uses the interesting word that these opportunities are unsought. So it's not that a soldier goes looking for a war to fight. It's not a mercenary who says, can I fight a war somewhere? Does somebody need my skills? So he says it's unsought. Nobody seeks a war. Wars, unfortunately, happen for a variety of reasons. And what he's saying is that for a soldier, it's important to do his duty or her duty when the war comes. Now, he then says that such an opportunity, such a willingness to do one's duty, opens the door to heaven, he calls it Svarg, loosely heaven. What it means is higher abodes, better dimensions. Now, people who have NDEs, as they call near-death experiences, call it a tunnel leading to the light. Now, there are those who believe these experiences are real. There are others who believe it's simply the function of a dying brain. Now, based on what Sri Krishna is saying, the listener, you will have to make your own decision. What is an NDE? You can investigate further if you're interested. The University of Virginia does a lot of work on this, and you can go to a link called med.virginia.edu and look up perceptual studies, and then look up the research, and you will find that there's a lot of information there. You can also see another article by Jeffrey Long, MD, and it's called, and if you type it in, Near-Death Experiences, Evidence for Their Reality. And he gives 9 lines of evidence which point to their reality. In other words, it is not a hallucination. It is not the result of a dying brain. And then you will have to reach your own conclusion. Let's go on to verse 33.
So now Bhagavan says one more reason. He says, Atachet tvamimam dharmyam sangramam na karishyasi tatah swadharmam kirtim cha hitva papam avapsyasi. He says, Atha, he says, however, chet tvam imam dharmyam. This dharmyam means righteousness war. Sangramam na karishyati. If you want to do this righteousness war, tataha, then what happens? He's giving 2 reasons. He says the 2 things. Swadharmam kirtincha. Swadharmam means your own dharma, which is righteousness or the religion, and kirti, oh sorry, not religion, duties I would say. Dharma is duty here. And kirti, your fame. Hitva papam. Hitva means abounding. Papam avapsyasi. The word papam people usually translate as sin, but papam is the great negativities or the negativities. So Bhagavan says, after losing that, you will reach to negativities.
So he says, if, however, you refuse to fight this righteous war, abandoning your social duty and reputation, you will certainly incur negative results. Now, again, the key word here is righteous war. He's not saying that one cannot be a conscientious objector to a war that is not righteous. But the right time to be a conscientious objector is before the war starts. It's not on the battlefield. So he first reminds Arjuna that this war is being fought for something that is right, and therefore must be fought. Now he also reminds Arjuna, so Bhagavan right now is being very practical. He's not going into religious, philosophic reasons. He's being purely practical right now with Arjuna. He will later give many other reasons. And he's reminding Arjuna that, look, you are a soldier. You've been a soldier all your life, or a warrior. Therefore, it's your social duty to fight. Now, we've seen in prior verses that failure to fight, to defend our group when it's under attack, amounts to cowardice. And you remember the words used, it's an affront to the human norm. That was in chapter 2, this very chapter, verse 3, if you go back and listen to that or read that. Now, by failing to do his duty, Arjuna will have done something that is intrinsically wrong or negative, and he will incur the consequences of doing that. One of the consequences, Bhagavan says very correctly, is Arjuna will lose his reputation. Now, why do we want to avoid losing reputation, according to Bhagavan? So, let's look first. What's the result of a good reputation when we say people have a good reputation? Now, according to the principles of social psychology, and I'm going to quote, self-esteem refers to the positive, high self-esteem, or negative, low self-esteem feelings that we have about ourselves. How do we view ourselves? We experience the positive feelings of high self-esteem when we believe that we are good, worthy, and that others view us positively. We experience negative feelings of low self-esteem when we believe we're inadequate and less worthy than others, or that others view us as less worthy. So the conclusion is that loss of reputation leads to loss of self-esteem. So in other words, what is he saying? That Arjuna will not feel good about himself. His self-respect, therefore, will decline. Now, there's a research paper published by the Faculty of Medicine in Trondheim, Norway. The researchers studied 201 adolescents over a 3-year period. So it was a fairly extensive study. And they concluded, again, I'm reading to you exactly what the paper concluded. Self-esteem is related to a person's ability to hold a favorable attitude towards oneself and to retain such positive beliefs in situations that are challenging, especially situations that include being evaluated by others. Adults possessing high global self-esteem are more likely to have higher well-being. So what is it here? Higher self-esteem leads to higher well-being. That means better social relations, experience of greater job satisfaction or duty satisfaction than their counterparts. And now look at their concluding sentence. Low self-esteem is related to, for example, emotional problems, substance abuse, and eating disorders. So very serious consequences when somebody has low self-esteem. In addition, they say, high self-esteem has an anxiety buffering function among students in an experimental setting. Likewise, threats to self-esteem have been shown to induce anxiety. So what does it mean in anxiety buffering functions? When somebody has a good opinion of themselves, a good self-esteem, and by this I don't mean somebody who's an egotist, but I mean somebody who genuinely has good self-esteem, believes that they're basically doing the right thing, have done the right thing. Anxiety buffering means that they're less subject to the effects of anxiety, worrying constantly about what will somebody think, what will happen to me when I do this, what will happen if I do something else. So they're buffered, they're protected, in other words. So loss of self-esteem leads to mental health issues. And if we look at the article, the role of self-esteem in the development of psychiatric problems, in other words, low self-esteem leads to psychiatric problems. A 3-year prospective study in a clinical sample of adolescents, it was published in Child Adolescent Psychiatry Mental Health, 2017. Now, obviously, the last thing Sri Krishna wants for any of us is this kind of outcome. What outcome? Low self-esteem, emotional problems, mental problems, anxiety, panic attacks. Much less so for Arjuna, of him who is, after all, we know, very fond. So now let's go on with more practical reasons, which he gives Arjuna.
Verse 34. Akirtim chapi bhutani kathayishyanti te vyayam sambhavitasya cha kirtir maranad atirichyate. He says, Akirtim chapi bhutani. Bhutani means, says the people. We start talking about your akirtim. He says, people will say that you are coward, you run away. And he says, Sambhavitasya cha kirtir. When the people who are respectable people, who once they will start saying that you are coward, it will be the worst, or it will be the worst than maranad. He says it is worse than death. So Bhagavan says that people will start talking about your akirti, that you are coward. So this is the meaning of that.
So he says, people, and this is a very practical verse, people will speak of you as a coward and a deserter. For a respectable person, infamy is worse than death. Very, very strong words from Bhagavan. So let's examine them. Why does he say infamy is worse than death for a respectable person? So he's now enumerating all the things that will happen to Arjuna because of what people will say about him. And he's trying to get Arjuna to picture the reality of what will that be like for him. Certainly they will accuse him of cowardice. What will they say? He ran away from the battlefield. He couldn't bring himself to fight a war. You know, everything we thought about Arjuna, he was noble, he was one of the strongest warriors, the best warriors. No, he just ran away from the battlefield. Who's Arjuna? Number 2, he just deserted his fellow soldiers. He just left them to it. He didn't care what happened to them. So then, Bhagavan makes a very interesting statement that for a person who was once held in high esteem and respect by other people, infamy, which is not just losing the good reputation, but acquiring a bad reputation, he says is worse than death. In other words, the person in such a situation would actually prefer to die. Now, there's a very interesting paper published in the University of Oxford's Health Education Research, which states the clinical literature suggests that low self-esteem is related to, now listen, depressed moods, depressive disorders, hopelessness, and now wait for it, suicidal tendencies and attempted suicide. What did Bhagavan say? The person would prefer to die. So the research 5,000 years after Bhagavan spoke these words completely corroborates what Sri Krishna himself said over 5,000 years ago. For a respectable person, infamy is worse than death. They would prefer to commit suicide. Now, the two of us sitting here don't believe that Bhagavan's words actually need any corroboration, but we give it for what it's worth for those who still believe that they need corroboration. We've both, I think, examined the text in sufficient detail over 18 chapters to realize that there's not a single error in it. There's not a single thing not backed up by science, and you will see that as we go through the Gita, if you have the patience. So keep being patient, and let's keep analyzing what Bhagavan says. In verse 35,
Bhayadranadu paratam mansante tvam maharathaha yesham cha tvam bahumato bhutva yasyasi laghavam. Bhagavan says that what they will think. Those people, Bhagavan says, those Maharathas, the great warriors, they will think that bhayat ranat kuparatam. Because of fear, he ran away from this battlefield. Yesham chatvam bahumato. For them you will become such a small person. You bhutva yasyasi laghavam. You will lose the respect in their mind, and you will get into the small kind of the person. So one says that they will think that you run away from battlefield because of fear, which warriors should not have.
so Sri Krishna continues to be intensely practical and very accurate. He says the great generals who hold you in high esteem will think that you fled from the battlefield out of fear, and thus will lose their respect for you. Now, having told Arjuna what people in general will say, he's now turning towards what fellow warriors, great warriors, will say. He said the great generals. Because after all, Arjuna is a Maharathi. Just like Bhishma, Dronacharya, Kripacharya. These are the people who are going to say that you were a coward and that you ran from the battlefield out of fear. Now, when they lose their respect for you, Bhagavan is saying, obviously your reputation will be severely dented, if not shattered completely. Now, why does he bring in the great generals? Because Arjun, being a great Maharathi or a great warrior himself, it's natural for us to care more for the opinion of our peers than it is to care for the opinion of others who may not be our peers. So for Arjun, he's going to be worried about what Dronacharya might say, Bhishma Pitama might say. He's going to be less worried about what the foot soldier will say, because they're not on the same level in skill. So this verse also defines what is infamy. It is when our equals or betters say negative things about us. And that's what we worry about.
Verse 37,
36.
36. Bhagavan says, Avatyavadanscha bahun vadishyanti tavahitah nindantas tava samarthyam tato dukkhataram nukim. The word Bhagavan is using avatyavadan. Avatyavadan means which is not to be said, and somebody says that. So he says they will use the harsh words which should not be said to you. Those people, tava ahitaha. ahitaha means who are your enemies. The enemies will say some harsh words towards you, and Bhagavan is using bahun. It's not limited. Bhagavan is saying they might say unlimited words towards you. And he says, Nindantaha tava samarthyam. Tava samarthyam, Bhagavan says, they will defend your abilities, your strong abilities. Then tato dukkha taramukhi. What is the worse than that? Or what is the more painful than that?
So we can see that Bhagavan is continuing his very, very practical advice to Arjuna right now. He says your enemies will defame and humiliate you with unkind words, disparaging your strong abilities. Alas, he said, what could be more painful than that? Now, it's quite normal that enemies say bad things about one. That's normal, to be expected. And Arjun would be able to put up with that. We all lay much less stress on what somebody says when we know that that person is somebody, say, who dislikes us or who has some vendetta against us. But the point Bhagavan is making here is that Arjun's stature was so great and he was held in such high regard that even his enemies had great respect for his abilities and his qualities of bravery and fearlessness. So it didn't matter whether somebody was Arjun's friend or his enemy. The point is that his skill levels were so high that even those who disagreed with him, maybe were his enemies, still had the greatest of respect for him. Now, what could be more painful for somebody than going from a position where even one's enemies respect one hugely to a position where even your friends and peers are now speaking ill of one? So again, Bhagavan simply pointing out the very practical result of Arjun just walking away from the battlefield.
It's now verse 37. Now Bhagavan is changing little bit before, as he said, that what others will talk. But now he's showing some different views. He says, Ato va prapsyasi swargam jitva va bhokshase mahim tasmaduttishta kaunteya yuddhaya krutanischayah. He says, Hato va prapsyasi swargam. If you will die in this battlefield, you will get swargam. He says you will get some heaven. Jitva va bhokshase mahim. But if you will win, then you will be king and you will enjoy this mahi is earth. So one says, then you will enjoy this earth. Tasmad uttishta kaunteya. Therefore, get up. Yuddhaya. Bhagavan is using word kaunteya, who is the son of Kunti, which is Arjun. Yuddhaya kruta nischaya. Be determined and get determined and fight. So yuddhaya means for fight. Kruta nischaya, be determined. So one says now again, this is very famous verse. It is used, tasmad uttishta kaunteya. One says now get up. Now stand up and fight for your righteousness.
So this says, if you fight, you will either be slain on the battlefield and go to the celestial abodes, or you will gain victory and enjoy the kingdom on earth. Therefore, arise with determination, O son of Kunti, and be prepared to fight. So Bhagavan is saying something very logical here, which is that, well, when you fight a battle, there are only two results. One, you get killed, or you prevail. So here, he's actually answering Arjun's almost unspoken worry that if I kill these people, I will go to hell. Not unspoken statement. Bhagavan here is also supporting the scriptures which say that in a fight for what is right leads to heaven. So we have to be very careful again reading this statement before we run to the conclusion Bhagavan's encouraging war. Remember, Bhagavan did everything he could to discourage the war. He traveled the length and breadth of Bharat to prevent the war, speaking to numerous kings, almost every king or prince he would lay hands on. He showed his Vishwarup. But he's saying that anything and everything I've done has not prevented the war, because we all have free will. So he's now saying that this is a fight for what is right. In a fight for what is right, he says, then the person who fights it, because they've done the right thing, will get swarg, a good abode. There is no negative result of trying to defend what's right. So he is again logically pointing out, well, there are two outcomes to the war. He's not promising Arjun any one outcome, if we notice. He's just saying that Arjun dies on the battlefield, possibility, in which case he's fought a righteous war. He will go to a restful place. He calls it a celestial abode. Alternatively, he would be victorious and have a good life as a prince with the opportunity, of course, to do more good to his people, to his kingdom, so on. In other words, both possible endings are good ones. And he therefore says to Arjun, get up and fight. That's what his advice is to Arjun.
Now, verse 38. Sukha dukkhe same krutva labha labhau jaya jayau tato yuddhaya yujyasva naivam papam avapsyasi. Now, this is very interesting verse. In previous verse, where Bhagavan is showing two things. One, if you fight and if you get death, you will get heaven. And if you will win, so he is showing if you will win, then you will enjoy earth. Now he shows dualism in that. Now again he is showing again more dualism in this verse. He says sukha dukkhe. Sukha is again joyful or happiness, and dukkham is distress or pain. Same krutva, make pain and or sorrow and happiness, make both equal. Then labha alabha. Labha is gain, alabha means losing. Jaya ajaya. Jaya means the victory. Ajaya means here losing, battlefield. Bhagavan says make these all three. He gives three things: the happiness and sorrow. Second thing is gain and losing. And third is victory and defeat. So Bhagavan says that these three things make three equal, and then yuddhaya yujyasva, get ready and engage with war. Naivam papam avapsyasi. If you make these three equal and if you get engaged in war, papam na avapsyasi, you will not reach or you will not get any kind of negativities. So Bhagavan is making sure before he is showing dualism, again he is here showing three different dualism that make those equal. Yeah.
So Bhagavan says to Arjun, fight for the sake of duty, treating alike happiness and distress, loss and gain, victory and defeat. Fulfilling your responsibility in this way, you will never incur a negative result. Now, this is a very interesting verse also, because this is not just a message to Arjun. It's a message for all of us as we go through our lives. There are many battles we'll have to fight for things that are right. But our battles should not be fought with bitterness or hatred or an unbalanced mind. Because look at the critical words. He says, treat alike happiness and distress. So he says, don't be either happy because you're winning or distressed because you think you're not winning. Treat loss and gain as alike, two sides of the same coin. Be indifferent to victory or defeat. So what is he actually saying? As you go through life's battles, fight for what is right, but with a detached mind. And Bhagavan will come to a detached mind again and again and again in later chapters. For now, he's saying let your mind be in a state that treats the same way what you think is a happy result or a not happy result, what you think might be a loss or a gain, and what you think might be victory or defeat. So he's asking Arjun now already, although he's not used those words, to work with detachment. Without worrying about the results of the work. Will I lose? Will I win? What will be the result if I lose or win? So work should be done purely because it is one's duty to do that work. All results should be viewed as equal because the results are not in our hand. And we will see that in a lot more detail in further verses. So he says, approach your work in an objective way. And if you work in this way, he says, you will not incur any negative result. And Bhagavan's saying this for two reasons. First, there is a book called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Consciousness, which shows that the human brain possesses 120 bits of information per second. Now, a Bell Labs engineer, Robert Lucky, also came up with the same figure independently. So if while fulfilling our responsibilities and duties, we're constantly worrying at the same time about whether we'll get loss or gain, victory, defeat, then think, your brain has a processing capacity, what did we say, 120 bits of information per second. So say you're sitting in the middle of an exam, it's one type of battle that we all have, and instead of the 120 bits of processing capacity we have, being focused on the question that's in front of us, we're worrying about, oh God, am I going to pass this exam? Oh, I need an A grade for this. I need to pass it because my job needs me to get such and such a grade. Part of that processing capacity of our brain is used up in worrying about possible results. In other words, we will not actually be focusing our entire brain capacity on the question in front of us. So we will not be able to carry out our duties. In this particular example I've given, we will not be able to write our exam answer as effectively as we could have done. That in turn could make the difference between winning or succeeding or being defeated, not completing the task successfully. Hence, Sri Krishna very correctly asks us to work for the sake of the work in a detached way. He's saying, while you're doing the work, don't sit there worrying about, will I pass the exam, will I not, will I win this battle, will I not, will I become the mayor of the town if that's what the person wants or not. Just do your work. Second, there's further research which was published 22 June 2021, fairly recently. And this research shows that those who have the ability to detach from their work benefit because psychological detachment is an important factor, it says, that alleviates the detrimental effects of heavy work investment of employees. And we'll come back to this again. Being positive about one's work also has a positive effect on one's well-being. Again, Bhagavan is asking Arjun not to have negative thoughts. Do your duty, he's saying, without worrying yourself about things like success and defeat, happiness or sorrow, which he'll say in later chapters. He will say, that is my role. That's not your role. He says, and see the article, to detach or not to detach. The role of psychological detachment on the relationship between heavy work investment and well-being, a latent profile analysis. It was published in Current Psychology. So verse 39.
Esha te bihita sankhye buddhir-yoge timam shrum buddhya yukto yaya partha karma bandham prahasyasi. So in previous verse, as we have seen that while Bhagavan was talking about the dual things, and he said that make your mind equal in that. Now Bhagavan says, Esha te abhita sankhye. Esha means this. Sankhya means analytic knowledge. Bhagavan says that I have explained this analytic knowledge to you. Buddhiri yoge trimam shranum. Now he says, now listen about Buddhi Yoga. Buddhi Yoga means which is understanding or intellect yoga. He says, Buddhya yukto yaya partha. Partha, who is the son of Prutha. Bhagavan says, by intellect or by understanding, if you will join these, karma bandham prahasyasi. Karma bandham is the bondage of karma. Prahasyasi, Bhagavan says that you will release or you will come out from this, the bondage of karma. So first, Bhagavan says that I have explained you what is Sankhya Yogam, which is analytic knowledge. Now Bhagavan says, I will tell you Buddhi Yoga. Buddhi Yoga means which is the understanding or intellect yoga.
So Bhagavan says, hitherto, up to now, I have explained to you Sankhya Yoga, or investigative and analytic knowledge, regarding the nature of the Atma. Now listen, O Parth, as I reveal Buddhi Yoga, or the Yoga intellect. When you work with such understanding, you will be freed from the bondage of karma. Now, just to remind readers, you remember he says, I've explained investigative and analytic knowledge. You remember in earlier verses, he tried to describe the Atma in many, many different ways. And he gave examples of you can't cut it with weapons, you can't burn it with fire, and so on. You remember multiple verses where he tries to explain. That's explaining it in an investigative or analytic way. What exactly is the Atma? He's saying, I'll explain that to you. Now he says, I'm going to explain to you the yoga of intellect. So having understood it analytically, now how are you going to understand it with your intellect? And he then says, when you work with this understanding, he says you will be freed from the bondage of karma. So having said that he will do that, what he's really saying is that I'm going to explain to you how to work using your intellect without expectation of specific results. And those are key words we should bear in mind because they're going to recur again and again and again throughout the Gita in different ways. He lays great stress on the ability to work with emotional detachment. That doesn't mean we don't work well. It doesn't mean that people become cold people. Sri Krishna was one of the warmest people, obviously, that ever existed. But he says, if you want to be free of the reactions of karma, he's saying then work in this way. Live your life in this way. And we already saw, remember the previous verse, why does the ability to detach oneself has a positive benefit? So he's also asking for our own physical and mental health. He's saying detach yourself from worrying about the results. Just do your work. Do your duty because it's your duty.
Now verse 40, one says, Neha bhikramana shosti pratyavayo na vidyate swalpamapyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. He says, na iha abhikramaha. Iha means here, in this manner. Bhagavan says, abhikramaha nashaha nasti. Bhagavan says, abhikrama means the beginning. He says, there is no end of, or there is no destruction of beginning. Pratyamaya na vidyati. He says, there is no end of this if you will work in this manner. Swalpam api asya dharmasya. Swalpa means little bit. If you follow your duty even little bit, trayate mahato bhayar. You will come out or you will be protected from the great fear. Bhagavan says, if you will follow a little bit of this duty, mahato bhayat trayate, from great fear, you will be protected from great fear.
So Bhagavan says, working in this manner, the yoga of intellect, on the path to moksha, meaning freedom from the cycle of birth and death, there is no beginning and no negativity or end, meaning loss or adverse result. And even a little effort on this path saves one from great danger. Now, as we'll come across many verses in the Gita of Sri Krishna, there's a lot packed into this seemingly simple words of his. So bear with me while I go through it in some detail. He says, working in this manner. So first question is, what manner? Now, research shows there are three types of workers. One is defined as heavy work investment, shortened to HWI, heavy work investment. These themselves subdivide into pure workaholics and two, those who are very engaged with their work, are very interested in their work. Now, workaholism refers to an individual who has an intense need to work with an internal drive that continuously pushes the person towards job-related activities, but without the necessary periods of rest. They're unable to detach themselves from the work. But someone with heavy work investment works equally heavily, but who is engaged refers to a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind whose characteristics are vigor, dedication, and absorption. So there are two different types of heavy work investment. And these two have entirely different mindsets, even though they may put in the same effort and the same hours into their work. But because their mindsets are different, they show completely different indicators of well-being. Work engagement is mostly associated with positive outcomes, but workaholism is associated with negative outcomes. Now, the research shows psychological detachment from work plays a role, says, in alleviating the detrimental impact that can result from the high workload of heavy work investors on their well-being outcomes. So, in other words, the attitude with which you approach your work is going to affect the impact on you of that work that you do, is what it's saying. Now, there are employees who have very little interest in their work. They have to stay in work for monetary reasons. The health and psychological effects of these are actually less damaging than a workaholic, but are nonetheless damaging. Spiritually, there's no point being a workaholic and forcing oneself to meditate or pray. It doesn't work. Then getting upset when it brings no instant results. It's better to be engaged, to want to do it, to do the very best of one's ability, than simply wait quietly for whatever results take place. Then Bhagwan uses another phrase. He says there is no negativity, meaning loss or adverse result. Now, we can see from the research that's taken place that if we can work in such a manner that we like all of our work, that we're enjoying the work is part of our duties. But we're able to detach ourselves from the work. And by detaching ourselves, it doesn't mean we don't care about the work. No, the person is very engaged in the work. The person wants to carry it out well. What it means here is that they're not worrying constantly about the results of that work. Then he says there is no loss or adverse result of our well-being or our health in any way. So in other words, spiritually speaking, praying, meditating, seeking to understand the Gita can certainly bring no loss or adverse result at all. So even if we fail to understand a verse and we read it again and again and again 10 times, but without getting frustrated, simply trying to understand it, he's saying it's not going to bring you any adverse result. Then he makes a statement, even a little effort saves one. We'll go into what it saves one from in a minute, but let's examine this phrase. Even a little effort, he says, saves one. So what this says is even a little effort. So Bhagavan is not unreasonable in the slightest. He's not asking us to throw some kind of switch, like turn on a light switch, off, on, to get to the state of mind and attitude. He knows it's going to take years to do that. And he's even saying it's fine to make even a little effort, slowly, over many years, perhaps even over many lives, over which we will build up the right frame of mind and understanding. So the important thing to understand is, in no way is Sri Krishna unreasonable and saying, no, I need to do this by tomorrow morning. Not at all. He's saying, make even a little effort. What's that famous phrase of Adi Shankaracharya's in the Bhaj Govind? Read the Gita even a little.
Bhagavad Gita Kinchid Adhita.
Kinchit. So, did it a little. So make a little effort on the end. So he understands nothing is learned instantaneously. It's not going to happen. So before we study calculus at high school or university, we do have to understand that 2 + 2 = 4. And Bhagavan understands that. That until you have learned 2 + 2 = 4, we learn to multiply, we learn to divide, we learn the concept of symbols. Obviously, you can't get to the calculus. So Bhagavan also is saying, I'm not expecting you to have a detached mind instantaneously. It's going to take many, many decades and probably many lifetimes too. So spiritually, he's not asking us to give up our lives, go to a cave, spend the rest of our lives in meditation. He's not asking for that. He says, make a little effort, bit by bit, to live in this world, but with the right attitude. Do your duty on a daily basis, whatever those duties might be. Try to give up worrying about the results. Leave those, he says, to me in later verses. So if we start on this path and then get distracted and stop, we will simply pick up where we left off. The effort is not wasted. Then Bhagavan uses the word. What does it save us from? He says, great danger. Now, those are very interesting words. So what dangers that Bhagavan is talking about? Why does he use such words? Again, pretty strong language. Well, workaholics develop a number of health problems: sleep troubles, frequent headaches, gastrointestinal issues, jaw pain, mood changes, burnout, a huge number of health issues. But a person who works with the same intensity but is able to work with detachment avoids all these dangers. So he says even a little bit of effort to work in this way will save the individual from great danger, health and mental issues. Now, spiritually, of course, the danger is we will get lost in this world. You'll get dragged down into it, trapped into a cycle of birth and death. And in later chapters, he asks us to live in this world like a lotus in the water. A lotus can grow in muddy water. It's the most hygroscopic plant on the planet. It's sitting in muddy water, but everything just drops off. It remains clean and pristine. And he's asking us to live, he says, in the same way. He'll come to that in later chapters. Now, we cannot be certain if we get lost in running after the trappings of this world, or any other world for that matter, that our next life will be even as good as this one is. So if we think we have problems in this life and we can't cope with it and get ourselves more and more and more mired in this world, we get depressed, we get anxious, we ruin our mental health, we ruin our physical health. How do we know that the next life will not be worse? So he's saying, don't look on this life as a terrible life, no matter what's happening to you. Cope with the problems and cope with them calmly. Because remember, this life determines the next one. Bhagavan will explain this in detail in later chapters. We will give you, of course, all the science papers, research backing it up. And we will do that at the time. But that's why he's saying that learn to work in this life, accepting the issues of this life with equanimity. So this has had a lot into it. Let's just summarize what exactly Sri Krishna is saying. He says work dedicatedly and with interest in the work. Don't do it mechanically, whatever that work might be. Make the effort to be detached. Don't waste your efforts worrying about the results. And don't waste the processing capacity of your brain in worrying about the results when you're doing a difficult task like an exam. Because when you waste that processing capacity, it means that you're not fully on the question or the task in hand. That will reduce your chance of doing it successfully. Doing this, he says, will save you from great danger. In a very practical sense, there are very serious health problems associated with it, mental as well as physical. Now, if we look at Sri Krishna's life, those of us who have, we'll find he was extremely active throughout his life, teaching, helping others, supporting friends, devoted to helping his devotees, counseling, defending, being present on this battlefield where he is right now with Arjuna, Kurukshetra, but always serene, always smiling. What did we find in chapter 2, the earlier verse? When Arjuna says, I will not fight, it says, he laughingly responded to Arjuna. So always smiling, laughing, teaching with the greatest of love, but also detachment. So he led by example.
Verse 41. Vyavasayatmika buddhihi ekeha kurunandana bahushakha hyanantascha buddhayo vyavasayinam. Bhagavan says, Vyavasayatmika buddhihi. Vyavasayatmika buddhi. Vyavasayatmika means the determined, buddhi means intellect. Bhagavan said the determined intellect, eka iha. In this manner, Bhagavan says, eka means they have one. So determined intellect will have one goal or oneness in their mind. But bahushakha hyanantascha buddhayo avyavasayinam. Vyavasayatmika is determined. Avyavasayinam means undetermined mindset or intellect. They have bahushakha. They have endless branches And Bhagavan says those are anantaha. Those are again infinite. So Bhagavan says that who has undetermined mind, their intellect will have endless branches. But who has vyavasayatmika buddhi, who has a determined mind, they have only one place. So, or one path.
So he says, O descendant of the Kurus, the intellect of those who are on this path is resolute, determined, focused. But the intellect or thoughts of those who are unfocused is many branched and endless. The first thing we should notice is his words, O descendant of the Kurus. You remember we said in the introduction that the Duryodhan and his brothers were called the Kauravas. The Pandavas were called the Pandavas, as if they were not descendants of the illustrious king Kuru, which itself was an insult, because of course they were. So here Bhagavan calls him, O descendant of the Kurus, giving him that respect. Then he's discussing now the characteristics of those who are on the path of the yoga intellect. You remember he said we'd come away from investigation analysis and are now coming to the path of the intellect. So when we're doing a task, it doesn't matter what the task is, writing a novel, studying, meditating, swimming, makes no difference. He says stay focused. Successful people generally have a high level of determination to achieve what they want and are able to focus on their tasks. Now, there is research into what happens when our minds wander aimlessly. And let me again read you the actual science research. It says the nature of people's activities had only a modest impact on whether their minds wandered and had almost no impact on the pleasantness of the topics to which their minds wandered. So what is this saying? It's saying two things. That the nature of what we do only has a modest impact on whether our minds wander. So our mind don't wander because what we're doing is something we find boring. There's not really a connection found between what we're doing and will our mind wander. And it has no impact, it says, on the pleasantness of the topics to which the mind wanders. So it doesn't mean that your mind will necessarily wander to a pleasant topic or an unpleasant topic. That depends on your mind. Second, multi-level regression reveals that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. So wandering mind is not a happy mind. So multi-level regression, it's a statistical tool which helps in the analysis of hierarchical or clustered structure, it's called. So give an example. Children with the same parents tend to be more alike in their physical and mental characteristics than individuals chosen at random from the population at large. Individuals may be further nested within geographical areas or institutions like schools or employers. So it's a tool that gathers information in such situations. The article is titled, A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind by Matthew A. Killingsworth and Daniel T. Gilbert, both Harvard University. And you can look up based on the title. So whether we want to be happy or we just want to achieve anything worthwhile, achieving our goal requires that our minds are focused. To achieve this also requires us to be determined. So the mind needs to be focused and we need to be determined that, yes, this is something I really wanted to do or wanted to achieve. So again, Bhagavan's advice from thousands of years ago is proving very well founded. If you keep letting your mind wander, you're not focused, you're not going to be a happy person. But then he also says those who lack determination and focus have minds with thoughts that branch out in different endless directions. Now take the example. So a really simple example we all do. We go shopping for meals for a couple of days. You walk into a local supermarket. What does an organized person do? They say, this is my menu. They make a list of all the ingredients. They go to the appropriate shelves. They pick it all up, put it in their basket or cart, as the case might be. They pay, they leave. Half our job. Now there's an alternative for an unfocused person. You go to the same store. You wander about aimlessly. You look at some fresh spaghetti and say, oh, I could make spaghetti tonight. Then you go to another aisle, you see lemongrass. Oh no, but on the other hand, I could make that Thai dish I like. Then you go to another aisle and you see curry powder. Oh, I could make an Indian curry dish tonight. You can go on aimlessly. Now you can spend 3 hours in that store picking up a bit of milk, picking up some cream for the pasta, then saying, oh no, I need the lemongrass. And you say, I don't have any time in my day. I went shopping for my family and I've taken 3 hours. Yeah, but why have you taken 3 hours? It's because you were not focused. And instead of saying, I'm going in with a purpose, I'm going to get my job done, and then I'm out doing other more worthwhile things, you're just going round and round and round the aisles, which is, of course, what, well, no doubt what the store would like you to do, because half the stuff will go home and go bad. Yeah, it'll all be gone. So we've done a seemingly endless task, which should have taken half an hour, and turned it into probably a 3-hour marathon job. And then we will complain, I just don't have any time in my day. When am I meant to meditate? When am I meant to do any of this stuff? Yeah. Well, in the time that you spent 3 hours wandering the aisles, you could have cut it to half an hour and then gone home and meditated. Bhagwan is saying much worse than the wastage of time. He says such people never achieve any happiness or success. All current research backs up his words. Now, how do you define success? You can define it in any way. Being a great sportsman, scientist, lawyer, wanting moksha, great rishi. It doesn't matter what the aim is. You have to focus the mind. And we will leave it there because Bhagwan will talk endlessly about the mind over multiple chapters. But thank you again for listening. Jai Shri Krishna.
Yes, yes.